Hey, thank you everyone for coming to the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series. Thank you for joining us today for the talk and introduction to focused ethnography with Dr. Megan Lefevbre. I'll just go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. You're all on mute right now, and you'll be on mute for the duration of the webinar. This one's going to be a little bit different. So instead of saving all the questions for the end, Megan's going to have a few sections throughout the webinar in which you can ask questions or have a group chat. So just be aware of that. All the questions won't be at the very end. My name's Yvette, and I work with the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. I'll be your facilitator today, and this webinar series is brought to you by IIQM, as well as Atlas TI, Qualitative Data Analysis, and the University of Georgia. So as I mentioned before, our presenter is Dr. Megan Lefevbre. She completed her PhD in qualitative epidemiology with the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. Her research was guided by the principles of community-based participatory research. As such, she worked with community and university partners using epidemiology and qualitative methods to explore why HIV-positive individuals with chaotic lives, e.g. experience unstable housing, substance use, involved in the sex trade, jailed, were able to take their HIV medication all the time. It was during her PhD, working with students, faculty mentors, and community partners, that Megan developed a passion for teaching, learning, and qualitative inquiry. She is now an instructor with the Faculty of Extension at the University of Alberta and has taught Introduction to Research Methods, Quality Engagement Studies, and mentors students with their qualitative thesis. Megan, we're very happy to have you here with us today. I will just make you the presenter.
Okay.
And you should be able to share your slides.
Show my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Yvette. As Yvette said, my name is Megan Lefevbre, and I'm an instructor at the University of Alberta. And today I'm going to talk with you about focused ethnography. But before we get started, I'd just like to share with you a few things about myself and my background to what led me to my research. So this is a photo of my family in 1984. I grew up in White Rock, Crescent Beach area, just outside of Vancouver, Canada. And this is a picture of the beach where my brother and I used to swim. I moved to Edmonton, Canada, about almost 10 years ago to pursue graduate work in epidemiology. It started off epidemiology, then I sort of transitioned to more of a qualitative, I called myself a qualitative epidemiologist. But at first, my research was highly influenced by this epidemiologist, Elizabeth Pisani. I thought she was really cool because she worked with HIV people, she was an epidemiologist, and she actually did a lot of work in the field. So she worked in Indonesia, and she spent time living with she mostly worked with prostitutes who had HIV, and she actually lived with them. She wrote this really neat book, The Wisdom of Whores, which influenced my work. But as I went through my graduate work, I became more influenced through Michael Agar, and I quote-unquote met him in literature. And he's an ethnographer, anthropologist that did a lot of work in New York and Baltimore with people who use drugs, and he tried to change the drug policy in America, and then he went on to be a personal consultant. I was also influenced by Maria Mann. She's a qualitative researcher and instructor, professor at the University of Alberta. She was also on my committee. And also this man, Yutaka Yasui, who's a biostatistician, and he was at the University of Alberta, and he was also on my committee, and now he works with Stanford. And he's really interesting because he's a cancer biostatistician or epidemiologist, but he taught me to see things differently. And he had a very open mind. My work ended up being quite far from his work, but he guided me a lot in my research. So that's one lesson that I learned from him that I still think about all the time. And all of these lessons culminated into my graduate work working with HIV people who have chaotic lives, and that's a word they use to describe themselves. So they're homeless, they are prostitutes, they're in jail, but they take their HIV medication all the time. And I'll go into that a little bit further later on. But this is some of my team, so some HIV positive participants, my community members, some of the HIV staff, and we actually ended up making a video of our research, and this is at the red carpet premiere. So this is us. And one last thing, I am a proud, relatively new mama. We have a son called Miles Grant Lefevbre, and this is Miles when he was 3 weeks old. This is Miles when he was 3 months old. This is Miles at 6 months, and this is Miles in August. He turned 2 in September. And I don't know if any of you are parents or take care of kids, but I've never spent so much time at construction sites. So that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years. But anyways, moving on. So for today, the objectives of this hour are to provide a basic understanding of the differences between traditional and focused ethnography. Then we'll outline some of the steps of doing focused ethnography. And then I hope you have, if your research question demands focused ethnography, I hope you get a sense of your plan and what the steps you need to take to complete your research project. And also the chat box here, I'll use the chat box, and anytime you have a question or a comment you want to bring forward to the group, please type it into the chat box. My husband Dennis is here, and he's going to be the chat box moderator.
Hello.
He's going to write down some of the questions, and every 15 minutes or so we can stop and sort of regroup and address any questions or concerns we have at that time. Okay, so let's get going. So to start off, traditional ethnography, what is it? Well, briefly we'll go over this, and this is Stephen Levitt. He wrote the book Freakonomics with Stephen Debner, and there's a chapter in the book called Why Do Drug Dealers Look at the Moms? And this is based on Sudhir Venkatesh's research. He's an ethnographer who started off his PhD in Chicago, and this is a really, really interesting TED Talk. The first 10 minutes really do a good job of just explaining what traditional ethnography are, and I highly recommend if you have time to watch it. But what Sudhir did was he went to Chicago to do his PhD with one of the sociologists there, and they were interested in their words, what it's like to be poor and black living in America. So Sudhir went with his survey, and he went to the Robert Taylor projects to find out what it's like to be poor and black in America. So he went in with his clipboard, he walked up, he went up the stairs, and what he found was he ran into some gang members, and they started shooting at him. And he said what he learned was shoot first, ask questions second. And he thought his clipboard probably saved his life. So after talking with the gang, he explained he's a sociologist and he had some questions for them. So they said, okay. And he started asking his questions. And his question was, one of them was, what is it like to be poor and black living in America? The answers were A, it was something like strongly agree, or I think the question was, I really like being poor and black and living in America. But the answers were A, strongly agree, B, agree, C, disagree, D, strongly disagree. And he says he found out the real answer was E, like you. So the gang talked to him and said, are you really serious about learning from us? You shouldn't be asking these kind of questions. You need to ask better questions. And he ended up actually living with the gang or just adjacent to the gang for 7 to 8 years. He befriended lots of members with the families, and he really got to understand what it was like to be in this gang. And he ended up doing a PhD out of it, and then he partnered with Stephen Levitt and wrote a book about it. So he did ethnography, traditional ethnography. He went into a foreign setting. He lived with them. He didn't have a research question. His research question ended up being way different from what he thought he was going to research. So that kind of outlines briefly what traditional ethnography was all about. It aims to answer what is going on here, and it relies a lot on participant observation and informal interviews to gain a full description, and Michael Agar would argue an interpretation of a group of people and their shared beliefs. So this man, Joseph Bradley, wrote this really good book called The Ethnographic Interview in the 70s, and he said, what is ethnography? He said, I want to know what you know in the way that you know it. Will you become my teacher and help me understand? So this is important because you go into the setting sort of with eyes like a child. You have assumptions, but you don't let your assumptions guide your research. You're open to new ways of thinking. You don't already have the answer. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing the research. And this sort of goes for focused ethnography as well. Michael Lager, he had a long career in ethnography, and he wrote a lot of neat things. And one of the neat things he wrote was a paper, and it was called Culture, Can You Take It Anywhere? And he talked about what we have learned from doing ethnography. And I'll just read you a little bit from his paper. He said, "We used to assume that culture was a closed, coherent system of meaning and action in which an individual always and only participated. You were a Nahebo or a Yorba, period. And all of you were pretty much the same as far as culture went. You lived in a place that was fairly small and isolated. With the exception of a market town and some nearby communities, you were linked by marriage. Your world was pretty much contained in that confined geographical box. And the box was closed in time because your culture was traditional. It stayed the same from one generation to the next. What people did could be described, explained, and generalized by their membership in that single shared culture. This is an oversimplification, if not a parody, but not by too much." So he says, generalizing one's culture, and in this paper he actually argues for cultures, onto everyone is a mistake. So for example, you are a Muslim, so you're like this, and so is everyone else. Everyone who is Muslim is like X and Y. Everyone fits into this box of characteristics which does not allow for variation. So we got it wrong, and this is a lesson that you should keep in mind if you're doing a focused ethnography. And on that note, we'll now go into talking a bit more about what focused ethnography actually is. But before I start, I have to say thank you to Maria. She was my teacher, my co-supervisor, my mentor. So these slides are what she taught me. And what I want you to do is I want you to consider your research question. And when we talk about what is focused ethnography, ask yourself, does your question demand focused ethnography as a method? So this is Gina Higginbottom, and she's a researcher at the U of A, and she says, focused ethnography focuses on cultures and subcultures framed within a discrete community or phenomenon and context, whereby participants have specific knowledge about an identified problem. So this is a big definition. Let's break this down. Why focused? What is focused ethnography? Well, focused ethnography is a method that focuses on a distinct problem. So in my research, I worked with Stan Houston, who's the director of the HIV program in Northern Alberta, and I spent a lot of time hanging out in a clinic with him. And we noticed that there was a group of people who were chaotic, and again, this is a word they used to describe themselves. So they were homeless, they used drugs, they were in jail, they were prostitutes, but they took their meds all the time. And this is really important because for HIV meds, you have to take your meds all the time or they won't work. And that means you can actually, the HIV in your blood, the amount can increase and you can develop AIDS or AIDS-defining illnesses, and you can progress to dying, which is tragic. Or you can actually spread HIV to another person, you can transmit it. And this was interesting because these people, it seems like they should have low adherence, but they actually had high adherence. So we wanted to know what their secret was. So we focused on this problem. What is your secret to taking your meds all the time? The focused ethnography research is conducted within a specific, often familiar context. So for my research, this was this context of people who are chaotic that hung out or resided in the inner city of Edmonton, among a subculture or small groups of people within society. So these people that are chaotic but take their meds all the time. And participants don't have to know each other, but they often come together because of a shared experience. And these are 3 of our participants, and we have permission to show their photos. And they all took their meds all the time, they had chaotic lives, they hung out in the inner city, and they didn't know each other before the research began, but after a few years, they actually were friends. And these photos, we had pizza parties to share a video. So one of my colleagues, her husband is a photographer, and he took these photos at the pizza parties pro bono, and then we developed them and gave them out to the participants. So unlike traditional ethnography where you're living or immersed fully in the setting and you're collecting data all the time, with focused ethnography, you go in for a specific reason. So you make short-term, purposeful visits. For us, I scheduled an interview, so I'd go in for this formal interview. And when you are in the field, quote unquote, you gather data intensively. So you can use a lot of different strategies. You can do informal interviews, formal interviews, participant observation. You can gather documents. You can gather tweets. You can gather, you can go doing walk-along interviews where you're walking through an environment with someone that has to do with your question. So the data, since you're there for such a short time, the data gathering is so intense. And lastly, the findings are applied to a practical problem. So the clinicians, they actually didn't know how come these people categorize. Why are they able to take their meds when other people who have stable lives, so they have social support, they have a home, they have a high income, they don't take their meds. And the literature often focuses on barriers why people didn't. But this was an actual problem that we needed solved. And I chose this picture to highlight this. This is our son Miles when he was 1, and he couldn't move. So we put him on the table right out of reach of his chocolate cake, and this is a practical problem that needs solving for him. How does he get to the cake? Well, we just moved the cake closer to him. So to end this section, this is a nice table of the comparison between focused and traditional ethnography that Gina Higginbottom and her colleagues have in their paper. And here's the reference, and if you want to, you can look at this on your own time. So what did we find? So this is my study. What did we find? Well, after talking with 14 HIV positive people who had chaotic lives, we found through the categories of family, self-worth, gratitude, support from the clinic, the HIV clinic, and the HIV community, and fear, that this theme of control. So participants felt like they had no control in their life except for HIV. So they compartmentalized things. They felt like they were a slave to the cocaine. They weren't raised right as a child, so they had no control. But with the meds, they did have control. And once they realized that they did have this control and they could take them all the time, their life improved, and they noticed these small improvements, and it was sort of an upward spiral for them. And this was neat because in the HIV literature around HIV medication adherence, control wasn't talked about. So this was something new that we added to the field, and the participants were able to share with their community. So again, now that we've briefly gone over what is focused ethnography, I want you to reconsider your question. Does your question still demand focused ethnography? And now we'll stop here and we'll have a brief chat, or if anyone has questions or comments they want to add, we can do that now. Just around questions around what is focused ethnography, things like that. And I should just mention that this is our cat, Hamilton Bruiser Lefevbre, and he's enjoying the cold one a couple summers ago. So if anyone has questions, comments, if they're unclear about something, we can stop and discuss now. Okay, it doesn't seem like anyone has questions at this time, so I'll keep going.
Oh, sorry, Megan. Yeah, it looks like Stephanie Zabriskie has a question. So, Stephanie, I'll see if I can give you the microphone and you can ask your question.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead, Stephanie.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep, I was just wondering in terms of, so the way that focused ethnography is defined, like what kinds of things might you need to have access to, or what might it actually look like to differentiate it from just an ethnography? And then specifically, I guess I'm thinking about what kinds of partnerships or relationships you might have to have built in advance to kind of make that happen, and then the actual like ethnography itself.
Sure. So I think I'll answer your second question in the next session, the next segment. Can I see if I answer it, and then if not, I'll try again?
Yes.
And then the first question, so one of the main differences between traditional and focused ethnography is traditionally with traditional ethnography, you don't have a research question. You go into the field, You see what's important, what seems to be an important question for that group of people. But with focused ethnography, you have a predefined research question already formed, which can change depending on the data you're gathering. If it's not speaking to your question, you should obviously change your question. But that's one of the big differences. And another difference is you don't live or spend that large amount of time in the setting. So you go in for those short-term purposeful visits. You don't have to live close to your setting. Does that help to answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Perfect. And then we have one more question from Ezra. So I'll give Ezra the mic and you can ask your question.
Okay.
Ezra, go ahead.
Oh, hi. I was just wondering how focused ethnography is different from a case study.
Oh, from case study.
Yeah.
So from what I learned about case study wasn't a method. You still have to have a method within your case study. So I learned it from case study as an approach.
Okay.
And then you still define your method. So I guess you could use focused ethnography within your case study. And I'm not an expert on case studies, but I know there's different multiple case studies, single case study. But from my understanding, you still have to define your method.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think we'll get going to the next section. And the next section is actually doing focused ethnography. So hopefully I'll be able to answer some more of your questions after this section. So again, I'm going to belabor this point. Consider your research question, and as we're going through step by step the steps in doing focused ethnography, does your question demand this method? So these are the steps we're going to go over. We're going to consider your motives. We're going to talk about creating focused ethnography research questions, finding a setting. Once you've found a setting, getting into the setting. When you're in the field, what kind of situations can arise, sampling, data gathering strategies and analysis techniques, and then we'll end by leaving the field. So the first part here is reflexivity. Before you even begin to gather data, when you're thinking about your question, you should be reflexive. What do I mean by this? Recognizing and being honest and clear about your identity and how these parts, so your ethnicity, your gender, your class, your education, how these parts affect your data, everything. So even the research question you're asking, how you gather your data, what, if you're doing interviews, what questions you choose to prompt and why, how you analyze your data, how you're interpreting this data, and even how you present this data. And this is Hamilton again, and he has his qualitative methods research glasses on because he's always being reflexive about his research. And this is Patty Lather, and she writes a lot about reflexivity, and she suggests that reflexivity is about framing, which is not a matter of looking harder or more closely, but of seeing what frames are seeing to determine the filters through which you are working and how this consistently changes. So the role of reflexivity within research, I guess, or in our case, focused ethnography, researchers should subject themselves to the equivalent degree of scrutiny as they direct towards their participants. And this is what McCorkle and Myers suggest in their paper. This is an excellent paper. It's What Difference Does Difference Make? Position and Privilege in the Field. And they actually they're two researchers, and they were reflexive about their PhD research after they had done it, when they were looking for jobs, and these questions kept on coming up. And they went back and wrote this paper about their experience. And this is the paper, and this is them. And I'll just read you a little bit about Jill McCorkle's experience. She says she did work with females in prison, so female prisoners. And this is when she was a research assistant for criminologists gathering data in the prisons. She said, the talk turned to drugs, different kinds and different highs. We were joking. I was telling her a story about getting paranoid on cocaine, and she looked at me really seriously. She asked if I had used a lot of drugs. I told her I had experimented here and there, but never got into it. Then she said, so if you were doing all these drugs and into all this trouble, how come you're not in here? I kind of stuttered because it hadn't occurred to me before, and I said, I don't know. I guess I don't like losing control. she got this disgusted look on her face and said, "So what you're saying is that we're out of control?" I denied meaning that, but from the look on her face, I wasn't terribly convinced. I don't know what I meant. And then McCorkle later went back and reflected on this, and she wrote, "Characterizing the women as out of control allowed me to preserve the illusion that we all face similar disadvantages earlier on. It meant that I could regard my early success in graduate school and my avoidance of prison as the product of hard work and strong character, rather than a byproduct of race, class, and other distinct advantages. For example, I was not the victim of physical or sexual violence. It meant that in the course of our relationship, I deserved to be the knower and they deserved to be the known." So this is, I think, McCorkle and Myers give excellent examples of what it's like to practice reflexivity, and before you start and then ongoing as you're conducting your research, to go back and think about why you did things, why you chose to probe certain questions, why you acted in a certain way, how you saw your data. So how do you do this? Well, I did this by asking myself these questions. Why did I choose to study what I was studying? Why this community? What were my assumptions or my expectations about my participants were studying? And what did I want to learn? So these questions you can also ask yourself before and during and even after your research. So the next step is research questions. Focused ethnographic research questions aim to understand a particular experience among a specific group of people. So I wanted to understand this experience of always taking your medications all the time among these people who, in their words, had chaotic lives. And Gina Higginbottom suggests research questions often take the what form. So for example, what are the common beliefs or values in a specific context? What are the characteristics? What's the relationship between? What is it like to? But these questions can also include the how or why, or what facilitates questions. So now that you have practiced some reflexivity, you have a research question that can change as you go on with your research, but you have somewhat of a question formed. You need to find a setting. So how do you do this? Sometimes you have convenient settings. Sometimes you have pre-established relationships within a community. So that's the case with my research. I worked with Stan, and he was the director of the HIV program, and I hung out in the clinic for a long time before we did the study. So I had these pre-established relationships with the clinic and the people that went to the clinic. But I want to caution you about being a helicopter researcher, and this is how I think of it, is when you have a research question, you approach a community, you want to work with them, you have your question, you helicopter in, you land, you do your research, and then you helicopter out, meaning you never really work with the community, you don't share your findings, they have no idea what went on. And this has happened to some communities in Northern Canada. So some communities actually aren't available to work with, or they've written their own research agreements. And this is an example of a research program that's gone well. It's called the Can Help Working Group, the Canadian Northern Helicobacter pylori Working Group. And I did some work with them in my PhD. And they work with researchers from the U of A, have partnered with a lot of different communities in the north to research H. pylori. But their partnership's so successful, it's 10 years now, that they've expanded. So we started in Aklavik, which is this photo here. It's past the Northern Circle. You have to take a small plane from Yellowknife and fly into Aklavik. And as a side note, you have to wear every single piece of clothing you own. They told me this in case the plane crashed and you're stranded, which is a little bit nerve-wracking. But they partnered so well with these communities that Aklavik told their friends, the surrounding communities, and now they have partnerships with Tuktoyaktuk, Old Crow, and there's two others that I forget the name. But so they've done this so well. They aren't helicopter researchers, and sort of when you find a setting and you want to work with the community, just be cautious about doing that. So it can be hard to get in, quote unquote, into the setting. And this is Daniel Wolf. He did his PhD at University of Alberta, and he was anthropologist, and he was curious. He wanted to know what it was like to ride with an in-law biker gang. But it took him 3 years to get in, and his research was, I say, somewhat covert because he approached this gang and he told them that he was a researcher and he wanted to research them, but he approached them as a gang member. He made himself appear like a gang member, but he actually wasn't. He, over the course of these years, sort of transformed to be able to get into the gang. And this is how he describes this experience. This is taken from his book. He said, "I fine-tuned my image before I approached the rebels. This was going to be my final make-it-or-break-it attempt. I purchased an old 1955 Harley-Davidson FL, a panhead, which I customized but later sold in favor of a mechanically more reliable 1972 Electroglide, a shovelhead. I had grown shoulder-length hair and a heavy beard. I bought a Harley-Davidson leather jacket and vest and wore studded leather wristbands and a sharp-tooth pendant and sported a cut-off denim jacket with assorted Harley-Davidson pins and patches, all symbolic of the outlaw biker worldview. While I was still very nervous about approaching the rebels, I had become more comfortable with myself. My public image expressed what I now felt was my personal character. There was no pretension. As far as I was concerned, I was a genuine biker who was intrigued with the notion of riding with an outlaw club. So it took him 3 years to get into a setting. And this is in opposition to Sudhir Venkatesh, who took him one night and he was held hostage and decided to go back. And Sudhir, this is Sudhir here, he wrote this really, I think, thrilling book about his experience. It's called Gang Leader for a Day, and I highly recommend it. And this is what he says about his experience. I woke up about 7:30 a.m. in a crack den, apartment 1603 in building number 2301 of the Robert Taylor Homes. Apartment 1603 was called the Roof, since everybody knew that you could get very, very high there, even higher if you climbed all the way to the building's actual rooftop. As I opened my eyes, I saw 24 people sprawled about, most of the men asleep on couches and the floor. No one had lived in the apartment for a while. The walls were peeling, and roaches skittered across the linoleum floor. The activities of the previous night, smoking crack, drinking, having sex, vomiting, had perked about 2 a.m. By then, the unconscious people outnumbered the conscious ones. And among the conscious ones, few had the cash to buy another hit of crack cocaine. That's when the Black Kings saw diminishing prospects for sales, closed up shop for the night. I fell asleep too on the floor. I hadn't come for the crack. I was here on a different mission. I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and for my research, I had taken to hanging out with the Black Kings, the local crack-selling gang. So it took him one night, and then he got in, and he developed a close relationship with the gang leader, and that's why he actually became gang leader for a day. And anyways, you can see the differences in getting into a setting. So now that you're, so what does it take to get into the field or into the setting? Well, I think your access to your setting will be enhanced if you're credible and you can justify your research. So Sudhir could justify why he wanted to do research with the Black Kings, and they said, okay, why don't you come back for another night? And Laughlin suggest if you have some connections to the people in the setting and you are ultimately perceived of those in the setting as a decent human being, you will be able to get into the field. So now you're in the field, now what? Well, so you have your research question, you found your setting, you've got in, now what? There's a few things that may come up, and these are some of the issues I guess I thought about during my research. One of them was presenting yourself in the field. Do you separate the professional and personal identity? If you do, how are you going to navigate that? And there was this paper wrote by Gary Fine, and it's called The 10 Lies of Ethnography. And he said that actually we say as an ethnographers or focused ethnographers, we say we're kind, we're friendly, we're honest, but really, is this actually true? And he calls people out and he said, sometimes we're not always kind, sometimes we're not always friendly, sometimes we're not always honest. And there was an experience in my research where I was interviewing this man about, he's chaotic, and he used his mental time, but he started talking about rape. Not that he was raping anyone, but he witnessed rape. And I just got an icky feeling. I didn't really like him. What he was saying wasn't really about medication adherence, but I remembered Gary Fine saying, it's okay, you don't have to like everyone, and this is fine. So at that point, I turned to him and I said, thank you very much for your time. We're gonna end the interview here. And that was that. And I felt okay with doing that because I had learned from Gary Fine that sometimes we don't have to be friends with everybody. Sometimes we don't have, well, in my case, friends with everybody. And that was it. We ended the interview and we moved on. The other issue is covert versus overt research. My question is, how much of our research is actually covert, meaning we ask our participants all of these questions, we ask them to share a lot about themselves. Do we share the same amount about ourselves? We ask them to share about themselves. Do we share the same amount about ourselves? So to what degree is our research still covert? And that's sort of that reflexivity question that McCorkle and Myers ask. Direct scrutiny, the same amount of scrutiny towards yourself as you would towards your participants. And then also when you're in the field, developing relationships, gaining trust. How do we gain trust? How do we appear credible? How do we form meaningful relationships? My research was guided by the principles of community-based research, and that literature always suggests we form meaningful relationships. But I had a hard time with this because how can our relationships be meaningful if there is some predetermined endpoint, or if they're sort of covert in a way where we're not sharing a lot? That balance between personal and professional, what is too much? So these are questions that I still don't have answers to. If anyone does, please share with the group. And then finding key informants. So that's always can be tricky. How do you do that when you're in the field? This is what Maria and Michael say about being in the field. Maria says, once an ethnographer, always an ethnographer. So you always look at things differently once you've done an ethnographic study. And Michael Hagar suggests most organizations have a few current crises that everyone talks about. What are they? Where do they happen in living color? Go and talk to both sides of the encounter a few times. So don't just focus on one side. Follow up on those negative cases. Make sure you're if something is there that you don't understand, that's your problem. That's your job as an ethnographer to follow up and figure out what's going on. So now we'll take this time and we'll have we'll sort of stop here and regroup. And if anyone has any questions about this next section, please feel free to ask them. And then I should say this is our dog, Franklin Lefevbre. He doesn't have a middle name, but we also call him Francochino, Frankfurter at Halloween because he dresses as a hot dog, or Franco. So with that, we'll end with we'll open the floor for questions or comments.
Okay, so we do have one from Lalita. Lalita, I'll unmute you and you can ask your question. Go ahead. Hi, Lalita, you can ask your question. Okay, if you don't have a microphone, then you can just type your question in and we'll get to it. And we also have Melanie Lee. You have a question? You can go ahead. You have the microphone.
Hi, no, I don't actually have a question. Can you hear me?
I can't really hear you, sorry.
No, it's fine. I don't really have a question.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Hey.
Okay, if there's anyone else. Okay. Oh, I think we're good. No new questions coming in.
Okay, so we'll move on to the last part here. Sampling. Just briefly, focused ethnography uses the purposeful sampling strategy where you choose your participants or if you're working with images or documents because of their particular characteristics. What do I mean by this? Well, Maria, in her book, suggests we should ask, who can give me the most and best information about my topic? In which context will I be able to gather the most and best information about my topic? And participants must be information rich, meaning they have experience, they want to talk about their experience, they are articulate, and they have to have the time to talk about their experience. So for you, I encourage you to think about what is your setting, how will you get in, and who are your participants, or your images, your documents. So I've already talked a little bit about data gathering, but data gathering is intense. So you go in for the short-term purposeful field visits, and you gather as much data as you can. So you can do formal or informal interviews, meaning formal, they're recorded, transcribed. You can take field notes. You can use reflexive notes, reflexive journals. You can gather documents. And what I did, I used formal interviews where I record and transcribe, and then I had a notebook with me. I always kept a notebook handy. And as we were doing that interview, I would write down different phrases or words that struck me, and then I would ask the person that could read these notes, and I would ask them to clarify. And sometimes if we were stuck on something, the notebook acted as sort of a third party where the focus wasn't on each other, it was on the notebook. We could talk about what I wrote, then other stuff would come up because of that. Also, you can use participant observation. It's not used a lot, but you can, and I use this. So this is us. These are the pizza parties. So I had my notebook, and I was doing a lot of participant observation at these pizza parties, and including these notes in my data analysis. And if you do choose to use participant observation and interview, expect contradictions between what you hear and what you see. And I had this happen once with this woman who I'll call LJ, and when she introduced herself to me as LJ, and she was chaotic. But it took her meds all the time. So we had our interview. It was great. She was very nice. She wanted to become more involved in the project. We met a few times over the years. She was involved in our video. And then when I left the interview, I was just sort of debriefing with the clinic staff, and they said, "Oh, you just met Panther." I was like, "What? I didn't meet Panther. I met LJ." They're like, "No, that's Panther. She just threatened to kill her street kids today." I was like, "What? She didn't mention any of this. This was totally opposite from what I had heard or observed in my interview." And so I went back to Maria, and we sort of debriefed, and we talked through why there was this contradiction. So if you see that, expect these things to happen, and then you have to work through why they happened. So for you, I think you should stop here and think, what are your data gathering strategies? What's feasible? What can you do? So data analysis, this is just brief. The focused ethnography uses content analysis, which is the process of identifying, coding, and categorizing the primary patterns in the data. And then you abstract the generalizations and explanations of the patterns that you see. And of course, this is key. Content analysis, so data analysis and data gathering, it's an iterative process. It's done at the same time. So you can gather a little bit of data, analyze that data, go back and gather more data. If there's a negative case, something that doesn't fit with the pattern that you're seeing, you can then go and follow up on that negative case and see if it actually is a negative case, or you just haven't asked that question. If you're asking these questions, why do you take your meds all the time, but they're talking about barriers, then you have to change your question. So when you gather and analyze at the same time, it provides you with this opportunity to be able to be flexible and adjust as you see fit. And then there's the rich points. So Michael Lager suggests rich points are something happened I didn't understand. Problems and understanding are called rich points. When a rich point occurs, an ethnographer learns that his or her assumptions about how the world works, usually implicit or out of awareness, are inadequate to understand that something has happened. And this is your job as the focused ethnographer to figure out what it is. There's something that struck you in the field, you don't get it, it's your problem, not the participants. You have to follow up on that rich point and figure out what's going on here. So rich points, or coherence as he sometimes calls them, this is a really good example. It's a 1-minute video. Here's the link, and it's called Cowboys Herding Cats. So these cowboys are herding cats. It's normal for them, but for us as ethnographers, we're going in and we're thinking, what the heck is going on? Why are they herding cats? This is a major rich point. It's our job to follow up with these cowboys to figure out, why are they herding cats? So you have to get to the bottom of that. And if you want to see how a good example of how the data analysis section is written up, I encourage you to go to this paper here, Diabetes and Pregnancy Among First Nations Women. This is by Dr. Richard Oster and his colleagues, and he lays out exactly, or they lay out exactly what they did in a nice, clear way on how they analyzed their data. I thought it was helpful for me. And then our last point here, leaving the field. So again, these are some of the questions that I have, some of the experience that I encountered, and I'll leave this with you. How long is too long in the field? How do you physically disconnect? How do you emotionally disconnect from the field? Do you ever leave the field? What if you work in your own community? Michael Agar says you cross the line between the field and home often and rapidly. And there's an example here. So right, two examples. This man that I was talking about, that participant who was talking about rape, and I had that icky feeling and I didn't like him, and I thought, oh good, this is the last time I'll ever see him. A few months later, I was driving my car, and I, at the time, didn't drive a lot, and it was snowing a lot in Edmonton. I was going down the back alley, and I was going so slow because there was a lot of snow. And I look over 2 houses, there he is shoveling snow. He actually lives 2 houses down from me. And I ended up seeing him a few more times, and that house was a bit transient. There's a lot of people that came and went, so he doesn't live there anymore. But at the time, he lived right beside me, and I was sort of freaked out because I didn't like him. And that was, for me, how did I leave the field? I couldn't, in this case, leave the field because I was always reminded of him. And just actually last month, I ran into a participant at Safeway when I was grocery shopping with my son Miles, and I hadn't seen this participant in about a year. This is another example. Can you ever leave the field? I find myself keep on running into these participants, and I was so excited to see him and introduce him to Miles. I'm like, this is Miles, and he didn't really care, which is okay. I get it. So for me, I lived very close to the community I worked with, and I find that I can't really leave the field. And then also, what is your commitment to the community? So you started this research with them. What is your commitment to them or with them? So this is the last question I'll ask you, and you can answer this for yourself. What responsibilities or commitment do you have to your participants in the community you do research with? Sorry for that, that's our cat Hamilton. He's always curious about focused ethnography. He loves learning about it. Daniel Wolf says a field worker will be a different person when he or she emerges from the field, and I have to agree with that. So we'll end here with this Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and I'll have to say thank you to my brother for sending me this funny graphic. And that's it. That's all I have on focused ethnography. So I'll again open the floor for questions or comments.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Megan, for that wonderful presentation. We do have a question, I think it was earlier from Lita, who didn't have a microphone. At a minimum, how much time do you need to spend in the field for a focused ethnography?
Well, I guess that depends on your question, on the type of data you're gathering, on how long it will take you to get into the field. Our project kept on having legs, so although we answered our first question, I spent about probably 2 or 2.5 years with this question, because once we found our answer, the participants were so thrilled about it that we wanted to do more and more. So I don't know if there's actually a prescribed set of time, but I I think it takes a long time, for me at least, to develop the relationships and to, I don't know, the project itself came together quite quick, but then the lots of the before and after sort of takes a long time. So I think you should allot quite a lot of time. Sorry, I can't really answer that question.
Okay, and next we have one from Romita. Romita, I'll give you the microphone if you want to ask your question. Romita, you can go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Oh, I do have connection. I think my question was, I had two questions. One is why focused ethnography is suitable only for small groups, or is it? I think my next question was, if a focused ethnographer does build meaningful relationships and doesn't want to do helicopter research, why can't the research question at least partly come out of the community rather than
Sorry, I couldn't hear that last part. I didn't get the last part of your question.
So yeah, if the researcher is not doing helicopter research and is building meaningful relationships, why can't the research question come out of from the community rather than from the researcher herself?
Oh, yeah, I think that's great. That's sort of how our research question came about. It was a question from the clinicians. And I think the research question can come that way, which is sort of in line with the principles of community-based research. So I agree with you that yes.
So clinicians, would you consider them the community that you are?
In my research, I defined that my community as the clinicians and the participants. We all work together. So you have this question that's coming, in my case, from the community, and it had a practical. It was the question that they wanted answered, so it was a practical question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so. It depends. And then to answer your first question, depends on since you gather data at the same time as you analyze. It depends when you answer the question. So if you talk with 10 people and by the 10th interview you're hearing nothing new, yep, everyone's saying the same thing, then you can stop and say, okay, we've answered a question. Or if by the 10th interview you keep on getting different things, you go on to interview or collect data, gather data further until you find that answer. So it doesn't have to, I guess the number doesn't have to be small, but it's more of a specific group of people with that particular experience that I was getting after.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect. And next we have Christina Clausen. Christina, I'll give you the microphone and you can ask your question.
Hello. So I wrote out my question. I hope it's kind of clear. I was wondering, when you encounter rich points, as you were talking about, and it's your responsibility, you were saying to figure it out as the ethnographer. Mm-hmm. How do you balance that role of trying to figure it out with the definition of ethnography as being, I want to know what you know in the way that you know it. Will you become my teacher and help me understand? So I was just wondering how to balance that. Like, how do you avoid imposing your own definition or explanation? And then what if the explanation you come up with is different than what the participant has been saying? What do you do with that if part of your goal is to know things the way the participant knows them?
Yeah, so well, for me, this everyone was saying basically the same thing, but one participant was saying, oh, the reason why I take my meds is God. He was homeless, God looks over me, God makes sure I'm okay. And I'd never heard that before, so I consider that a rich point or something new, and I had to follow it up. So then I went to my next participant and said, when we were discussing and having our chat, I said, oh, some other participants have mentioned God. How does spirituality speak to you? And they said, oh, no, it doesn't. And I ask that all the time. So I balanced it that way, saying I've heard from others that spirituality is important. How does this play out for you? And they would say, well, everyone else said no. So
Okay.
that's how I saw that fitting in.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, and next we have another one from Stephanie. Stephanie, I'll give you the microphone.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions. I guess outside of participants' observation and interviews, what other types of data collection did you use?
Oh, I use reflexive notes. So after each interview or participant observation session, I'd have a separate notebook and I'd write down how the interview went, why I probed things a certain way, what I would do differently, why I felt certain ways. So I included those kind of that kind of data in my data analysis. And yeah, the main one that's the main. I didn't really gather documents per se. There weren't it wasn't applicable to mine. So I used interview, informal and formal, personal observation, and my reflexive journals, and the interview notes I took as I was doing the interview.
Okay. So then I guess I had two more questions, and my next one might build off of that one. So I don't know if you've ever heard of institutional ethnography, and I guess that would be where you might bring in the text and stuff. But I was wondering, I guess, about your use of theory in the focused ethnography. Like, how is it applied to the work that you did, or did you use it? And if so, which one informed your work?
Yeah, I was aware, of course, of different theories of medication adherence, but I didn't want to put that theory onto my research because then I felt like I would just be sort of reinventing the wheel. I wanted to come up some sort of work inductively.
Yep.
So I used it that way. It was more of a background information to my setting, to my question, to my participants.
In the analysis process, I guess specifically too, like sometimes it's hard to do like unless you have some kind of a framework to do your analysis against, or if you were using a grounded theory approach, or.
No, I wasn't. I consider grounded theory a method, so I wasn't using that. I was using content analysis as my data analysis technique, where I was reading over all the transcripts. I would highlight separate phrases or words that struck me, and then I would take those, cut them, and paste them, and put them together to make a pattern. And once I saw the same patterns that were coming up over and over again, then I would make categories. So lots of people talked about family. That's why they took their medication. Lots of people talked about this support from the community. So that was a different category. So then I had 5 categories, and I thought, what's the overarching theme that ties these categories together? So I didn't work from a theory.
Okay. And then just the last one, I was wondering, like if you're unable to spend long periods of time in the field, so you might have limited access just by nature. So for example, maybe you're looking inside prisons, like your previous example, and you're dealing with things like lockdown or just limited access. Would you then by default almost have to consider it a focused ethnography?
Yeah, I guess so, because you couldn't. Yeah, it would be very difficult to immerse yourself, like spend long periods of time as a traditional ethnography would. And also, if you have already a question going in traditional ethnography, traditionally, you would move somewhere or you would go somewhere and just hang out with people and see what's going on. But with focused ethnography, you don't spend those prolonged periods of time, and you already have a question. So I guess so.
Right. So like if you didn't have a question and you weren't able to spend long periods of time there, you might have to kind of do some extra work and rethinking about the type of research that you
might maybe if you just hung out at your setting, you don't have to move in, but just because for me, I just hung out in the clinic for a long time beforehand, and then this question came up when I was talking with the clinicians and talking with the participants. So it was kind of that way. Does that help?
Yeah. No, I I guess it's just like choosing an approach that's kind of a best fit. So like I'm looking at doing ethnography for my own PhD work, and so I'm looking at a specific problem solving court, and so they only sit once a week, and so I can potentially go a lot of weeks. And then is it focused or would I still be able to call it like something else, even if it's only 1 day a week, but I'm going for a long period of time? Like, I guess it sounds like that doesn't matter. It's more about whether you have a question when you're going in or not.
Yeah, I think so. And there could be more than one method to answer your question.
Well, I'm using institutional ethnography just because of the dominance of texts and policies and guidelines in legal settings and how important it is to pay attention to those things. And so I'll have a lot more written material, I think, and less so observations and interaction than.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm just considering, like, depending on how much time and am I having a question going in or not, is there even a thing as like a focused institutional ethnography? I'm just learning and thinking in my own kind of how I could do that.
Hybrid. I haven't come across that hybrid, but I don't know. I don't know the answer. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. You gave a lot of good references that I can read and look from, but I was just wondering if that was something that you'd thought about or come across, but that's okay.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Okay, perfect. And we're just past time. So if there's anyone else, Megan, I don't know if you have contact information, if there's people that didn't have or weren't able to have their questions answered, then Megan's email is there and you can get a hold of her that way. This is our last webinar for 2018, but we are compiling the list for 2019. So we are not able to do these webinars without your support. So thank you all for coming and attending, and we'll hope to see you in 2019. Megan, did you have any final words?
No, I just want to say thank you very much for coming and participating. And if you need to contact me anytime, please do.
Perfect. Okay, so that's it for our webinar today. So thank you all for coming and have a good holiday season. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.